Alrighty. Well, we'll make a start because we've got a bit to get through, and we're expecting some great conversation at the end. So I'll start off. I'll just introduce myself. My name's Jack. I'm the product manager at Paddock. On this call as well today, we've got Katie and Tom, that I imagine you both know. Katie's our head of customer success, and Tom is, of course, one of our founders as well. But we're all here, of course, to hear from Chris, who's going to run us through this sort of evolving landscape around nitrogen at the moment. It seems to be changing daily or hourly, depending on how much news you choose to consume. So really, I just want to run through a couple of things before we kick off. So housekeeping, just please stay on mute unless you're asking a question. If you do have a question at any point, please don't hesitate to either drop it in the chat or actually, just unmute and ask it directly to Chris. Chris is always happy to have those conversations as he goes, rather than you sitting on something and then perhaps missing your opportunity to ask it. So as Chris just gets started, I just want to going to pop up a quick little poll, which is something really to spur on a bit of conversation, get your minds ticking over, and then certainly Chris always finds it interesting and may focus on some specific areas in his presentation, or certainly his discussion at the end. So, Chris, I'll hand over to you. Everyone, if you wouldn't mind answering that poll, that'd be great. I'll just leave it open for a minute or so. Chris, if you're... Oh, there we go.
Okay, then. Thanks, Jack. Welcome everybody. As Jack said, this is I suppose, an interesting time. I suppose we faced this to somewhat a few years ago with the first disruption. What was it, 2021? When this sort of spike in urea prices occurred as a result of a disruption, or the concern over what the effect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine might bring to another area of, I suppose, significant production of nitrogen molecules for agriculture. It's not really the same because in that case, it was mostly about ammonia supply, not more so than urea. And then obviously ammonia out of those areas supplies urea plants, but in this case we've got urea in particular, which constitutes 44% of all imports of fertilizer into Australia, and Australia is only 15% sufficient in urea. We've got a bit of a problem looming, and some decisions that I suppose some of them we'll have to review in hindsight because they've already been made and implemented, and there's some coming up further, and that's really what we can't change what's happened already, but we can certainly look forward and make the best out of what's likely coming at us. So the idea of today, as Jack said, is for you. I'm happy to have interaction and welcome it anytime during the webinar. And if you want to, you can raise your hand. There's a control there that's on the screen that just says raise your hand. By all means, do that, and someone will flag me to shut up and let you say something. Or the other option is to type in a question into the chat, and depending on the nature of it, we'll either answer it straight away, or we can leave it to the end and make sure it's part of the conversation that we have at the end. So, a lot's changed or changes regularly in this nutrition space. And this is just another one that we have to put up with, is, the change as a result of the situation. And look, as I see it, we've got two scenarios, and in some ways we need to respond differently to both of them. The first one is we only have high price. So, we know that the price since December last year has nearly doubled for urea. And that sort of sends us off on a range of measures to understand how we can get the best out of the urea when it's a higher price. The other one that's probably more concerning, and we really don't know what's happening in this space, is we know that we've got ships of urea arriving in Australia till the end of July, but sorry, end of April. But what happens if we have high price and short supply? In other words, no more urea coming into Australia, or significantly less, in July and to September. Remembering that period also coincides with a high demand for cotton, so and summer crops. So where we would have an early arrangement of ships, there are going to be possibly short supply. I can't say that that's going to happen, and you can ask your local supplier, but we need to plan for both of those because they have slightly different ways that we should go about looking at responding to those. And I've just taken it through to July to September, but if people are in summer crop areas or growing cotton also, there is that, I suppose, discussion that you would have about, how do we look at this between winter crop and summer crop, particularly if you've still got urea in the shed and are still waiting to do something with it. Where can I make the most money out of that urea that I have? So what I'll try and do is indicate where the scenarios interact with those particular the particular I suppose things that I'm going to say about using nitrogen. So one of the things that fundamentally hasn't changed is the nitrogen cycle. Funny enough, it is the same. So we've still got nitrogen coming from crop residues. We've still got nitrogen coming from organic matter. We've still got a defined store of soil mineral nitrogen that is there now, that was there now, and we've got mineralisation that's going to take place between the time that you put urea into the ground and the time the crop actually stops taking up nitrogen. The thing that has changed is this pool here. And that's really where the discussion is. So, and that pool is dependent on, just the way that we handle the knowledge about what our crop residue nitrogen mineralisation is going to be, what our soil organic matter mineralisation is going to be from that humic pool, your organic carbon measure in the soil, and what we know about the amount and location of mineral N in the soil. All of those feed into our fertiliser N strategy. So what we've currently got to, I suppose, concern us in that fertiliser N area, the quantity and the efficiency with its use. They're the things that we can actually modify, and we do that through the use of the strategic use of products and targeting of rates and targeting of nutrients between different crop species. Is it better to put something, put my fertiliser on my barley or canola or wheat, or do I just reduce the rate across all of them? These are the questions I think people are asking. So, really, those things that are underground now are givens. They are what they are. It is important in this situation to understand what they're going to contribute, because if we're going to start reducing nitrogen rates because either it's the economics don't stack up or the supply isn't there to go with the rates that I would like to put on, then we've got to make some decisions about that fertiliser in relation to what products do I use, what rates do I put on, and what's the trade-offs, and are there some efficiency measures that I can get into the system that takes me from I've been putting on a rate and it's based on a particular efficiency of the tactics that I use. Is there an opportunity to improve that so I can get more out of the same rate, or I can put less on and get the same result? And that's what we're trying to do. But fundamentally, the cycle hasn't changed. It's just the relationship between the crop price and the nitrogen price that is really driving this discussion as much as anything. So one of the questions when we're talking about efficiency is, okay, where are you now? So if we want to change and improve efficiency, or we want to know just how if there's an opportunity to do something better, then how's my combination of tactics, particularly rate, timing, and placement, how are they sitting up now? And this is just a quick table to say, here's for a cereal crop. If I'm growing 3 tonne and I'm using 200 kilograms of N of cereals, I'm over here at 15 kilograms of grain per kilogram of N applied. That would be classified as a low efficiency. So if that's the case, then there's possibly some opportunity to either understand why the crop is not yielding more for that amount of N, and if it's a constraint that can't be overcome seasonally, then the question is, I should be reducing my nitrogen rate to something that is more suited to the yield potential of that paddock, given the constraint that's there. But if I'm using 75 kilos and producing 3 tonne, then that's around the bottom of the optimum zone. And the optimum zone and this is called the partial factor productivity of nitrogen fertilizer. And, in international and Australian data would suggest the same, that somewhere between 40 and 90. If you're sitting between 40 and 90, you're probably doing a reasonable job on average over a range of seasons. If we're getting up too high, it means we're probably mining soil nitrogen from the organic pool, or we have a reasonable rotation of pulses or grain or legumes in there that are feeding some nitrogen into the system. It's coming from somewhere else. And in that case, it could be mining the nitrogen out of the soil through long fallowing. So we're ending up with high productivity at seemingly very low nitrogen rates. Short term, not a bad place to be in. And it's probably, if you're up in these ranges, it's a good year to be doing that, because it just means you can get away lower rates of nitrogen. But if you're down this end, we've got to understand, particularly getting out into some of these red numbers below 20, then we've got to understand whether that's because it's too much nitrogen or too little yield for the nitrogen rate that's being applied. So if you want to do those numbers in your head, or you can identify a paddock last year, these are things, it's like the fuel gauge on your car. How many miles per gallon am I getting? I know the tank holds 63 litres, and I know I do 1,000 kilometres, but it's a number we know for mileage on a car, but sadly, not many people can quote for the efficiency of fertiliser nitrogen that's being used. So it's a good place to start, and it's easy to calculate. So the question is, how and if we start at the fundamentals, how and why do we know where fertiliser might be required? And there's a range of historical things. If people don't have a soil test or don't have a history of soil testing to confirm some of these things, then there's a range of things that we can tick off. As you can see, have I seen nitrogen deficiency symptoms before, and when was it? Have I seen nil strips where I've missed a strip, and am I seeing a response? We can use things like enriched strips. We can use historical grain protein in cereals, organic carbon content. There's just a range of things, that historical indicators we can use to say the more times these things add up and the lower some of these things get, then it starts to hint towards a regular response. And that's what, in a year when we're facing what we are with the nitrogen prices, we want to make sure that we're getting responses to get a return on the investment. The other ones are seasonal indicators. So fallow length and rainfall. Long fallow and not much rainfall, tend to the long fallow tends to fill up the mineral soil nitrogen, and the rainfall has to come with it, because we need wetting and drying cycles to release it. So if we've had lots of wetting and drying cycles and good rainfall to take the nitrogen further into the profile, it's probably an indicator of reasonable nitrogen, other than where the organic carbon level in the soil is extremely low. So that's where some of these historical things actually can affect your seasonal interpretation. I've bolded two there that are probably the main seasonal indicators: the mineral soil nitrogen content in the root zone, how much is there and where is it? Because that certainly does affect. If it's all in the surface and none at depth, and we end up with a fairly dry season through till September, it doesn't matter how much is in the surface. If the roots can't get it, then it's not where it needs to be. The other one is seasonal soil and mineralisation potential. So, and these two things go together, because in any situation, we've got to understand during the fallow, and when we do a soil test, whether we're seeing the soil mineral content as being a reflection of the mineralisation that's happened already, or is the mineral N not reflecting what could happen across the season? And that's more common in southern environments, where the summer has been, if it's been dry and we haven't had many wetting events, then we may not have had much mineralisation, particularly after canola crops and pulses that can mineralise quickly. Then we could have a low mineral N content, but a high mineralisation potential in spring, should we get rain. So we end up getting the nitrogen released then rather than in the autumn. Available soil water, more about the reliability of the nitrogen that's there, and then any forecasts and physical conditions that might interact with uptake. And that relates to mineral soil nitrogen, particularly deep in the soil. We've got to make sure that that is truly available. We don't have salinity or something else, or extreme sodicity down there that might affect the nitrogen that's available. So these are all indications of the requirement for nitrogen, and I suppose most people will probably look at mineral nitrogen at this time of year as being a major indicator of what's likely to happen for the rest of the season. So decisions in 2006, it's all about priorities. I suppose people could take okay, I'm just going to take it on the nose. Cash flow can take this in, or I'll not do something else, and I'll just do what I normally do. But other people are probably in situations of saying, well, how do I prioritise? How do I allocate this to make sure I keep my risk at no higher than in the past, and I'm willing to do a little bit of shifting around. Now, I'm not going to talk from here about the priorities such as increasing the pulse area, because I don't need nitrogen on pulse crops. I'm really going to talk about cereals and oilseeds that actually require nitrogen fertiliser. I think the opportunity to switch to pulses and those sort of things would probably had to have been made a long time ago, and possibly herbicide and other paddock things that are set in place, rotational rules, will probably rule out too much changing of that type. So it's really about how do we allocate the nitrogen across either the crops or zones, and how do we fine tune that. So as far as location goes, I think we all know that paddocks are not even. And there's various measures of unevenness that we can actually look at to understand either across paddocks or within paddocks, are there opportunities to either improve the performance or lower the rate on average because we're fertilising everything together. So things like protein maps are very, very insightful if you've got them, as to, and I'll show you a little further on, how that relates to the soil nitrogen, how we can understand that. If we take it a little bit further out into space and we think something like normal differential red index, which is a measure of chlorophyll density. That's another way of actually getting some understanding of the variability of nitrogen in the paddock from last year. Obviously, we don't know that from this year. But again, that NDRE at maximum biomass probably relates reasonably well to grain protein outcomes or nitrogen uptake into the crop outcomes. The other one is things like organic matter. If anyone has gone down the route of carbon accounting, they possibly have soil carbon stocks maps. Just remember your organic nitrogen stock is about 1/9th to 1/11th of the carbon stock. And if we have a look at a map of organic matter, we can backwards infer areas that have higher levels of total nitrogen in the soil and are likely to be able to mineralize more than other areas. All good background information to make nitrogen decisions. So where we put it, if there's an opportunity, if you've got zones that are based on these sort of information, that becomes pretty useful if we want to start doing some precision ag approaches to using that information to put variable rates out to help out with the situation. So this is just an example of just how the grain protein or NDRE type analysis might pan out. This is a plot of residual soil nitrogen and the grain protein content of wheat. This is some stuff Emma Moffat did in 2021. And it was based on these quadrats that were cut. And you can see there's a pretty strong relationship between the residual soil nitrogen and the grain protein achievement in the previous season. So, at about 11.5, it's sort of fairly scattered and it's pretty constant. But once we get above 11.5, it starts to grow quite rapidly. This is some work that I was involved in at the Taluna long-term site when I was with IPL many years ago. And the same thing for wheat there. You can see a very strong relationship between the grain protein outcome and the residual soil N. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is the difference in scale. It depends on the site. So what you really got to do in this situation is go back and ground truth what 10.5% relates to as far as residual nitrogen. And then you can possibly, and the same with once we get above 13.5 and then another maybe group in between. And then you can basically divide it up into three and say, look, for everything that's less than 11.5%, we're probably, in this case, it was about 15 kilograms of N left. Between there and 13%, we probably had 25, and above there, who knows? It just took off. The same over here. So that's how we can understand that spatial variability of using protein and how we can respond to that as far as understanding what residual nitrogen's there. And then we can use that into some of our equations to understand what rate we might need at each of those sites, because residual soil nitrogen is basically what we're doing. We're measuring in soil in pre-plant nitrogen soil tests. Okay, what I'm going to do is that's location. I'm going to swap into the notion of how crop responsiveness, how that relates to N economics. Now, in any situation when we soil test and we grow a crop, the crop supply is coming from soil N and fertilizer N. And we have this point where this green line can move this way, which means we've got less soil in, we need more fertilizer in. If it moves this way, if we've got more soil in and we require less fertilizer in. So at the same time as that's varying, the actual response, the amount of grain we get per kilogram of fertilizer in, reduces. It's the law of diminishing returns. As the soil N amount increases, the response to fertilizer decreases. And these are some numbers that are sort of in the range of what you'd expect. Obviously, once we get to 100% yield, we put more fertilizer in. We get no more kilograms of grain per kilogram of fertilizer in. We might get some protein kick, but in recent years and current indications of pricing are not favourable towards getting a boost or a payable return just on protein alone. So if we didn't have much nitrogen in the soil, we tend to get a lot more kilograms of grain per kilogram of fertilizer applied. Now that's the notion. And the same goes for the marginal nitrogen efficiency, and this is a sort of a different scale, is as we get more soil nitrate nitrogen, the efficiency of the nitrogen used decreases. And this is for a situation for about 2 to 3 tonnes per hectare. So, the first kilogram of nitrogen we put on, we can get 140 kilograms of grain per kilogram of N. But as the more nitrogen in the soil, the efficiency tends to drop off. So we end up with 40. This is for soil nitrogen, this one's for fertilizer nitrogen. And as we know from most of the research, that fertilizer nitrogen is probably at best 40% as efficient as soil nitrogen, and as low as 10%. So you can divide this by 3 or 4, which brings it into line with what I've got here is the response to fertilizer nitrogen. So it's the law of diminishing returns, just in another way. The more soil N we've got, the less response we get to fertilizer nitrogen. Therefore, we have less money in response to pay for the fertilizer. Now, to extend that a little bit further, what I've done is have a look at where we were last year and what we're looking at possibly with the price of urea going from about $700 to possibly $1,400. Now, we can disagree about or agree that that's the number, but this is really about what happens if the fertilizer price doubles. And how does that relate to canola and a cereal crop? Because they have very different responses to nitrogen. So a canola crop, the kilograms of N per kilogram, the kilograms of grain per kilogram of N is generally in the range of 5. If it's less than 5, you're probably getting to a situation where you're not going to see much response. And it can be 3 times that, up around 15 kilograms. And for cereals, you can see it's a different number. We can get a low end for cereals, probably about 15 kilograms, and a general response, rather than being really deficient, getting monstrous responses, it's probably around 25 average is something that you could say is a responsive situation. And what I've done is put 2 grain prices in because they're uncertain at the moment. I've put $600 and $800 per tonne of canola and 300 and 350 of wheat. And that's the best I could I'll get off the internet on sort of the range that is likely for to be around at the end of this season. So, if we look at 5 kilograms of the income of 5 kilograms of extra grain per kilogram of N, we come up with the extra income being $3. Of course, if we're getting 3 times the response, we expect the numbers to be 3 times bigger. This number down here is the return ratio. So for every $1.50 we invest, we got $3 back. That's a 2-to-1 return. So at $600 at a low responsive situation for canola, maybe last year we're getting $2 or a 2-to-1 return. At $800, that's nearly 3-to-1. And of course, if we go over to 15, you can see we're getting 6 to 8 to 1. So, putting nitrogen on responsive canola crops is relative, well, is very profitable because, gee, I'd like to be getting bank interest rates of 6 and 800, but realizing that money goes out and it's got a risk premium and it's got an opportunity premium, that it could be used somewhere else at a higher return. We always have to factor that into, you know, economic optimum is supposed to be 1 to 1, but in agriculture, there is lots of other ways you can use the money, and there's always putting it out there with a risk premium that would probably suggest somewhere 2 to 3 to 1 is what most people are probably looking for. So, you know, canola, even last year, if you're able to get $800, putting it on in marginally responsive situations, you know, you could ask whether it should go somewhere else more responsive. So if we look at cereals in the same light, 300, 350, 15, you can see we possibly would make more money in cereals in a low responsive situation. Remember, 5 kilograms of grain response per kilogram of N for canola is probably similar to 15. You can see in low responsive situations, because of the, I suppose the price is not 3 times, that in low responsive situations, you might be better off putting them on cereals under that circumstance. So your returns 2 to 1 and 2.7. In cereals, it's 3 and 3.5, and the same. But you can see in highly responsive situations, 6 and 8 to 1, versus in cereals around 5 to 6 to 1. So what to me that's saying is if you're going to muck around with what nitrogen do I put on one crop, because it's the price, it's not a limitation of supply, it's the price that's driving my decisions. In less responsive situations, possibly support the wheat, and in the highly responsive situations, put it on your canola, because your canola is going to give you a lot more return. Now, the next question is, okay, if I go to $1,300 a tonne or $3 a kilogram of N, does that change? And how does it change? So swapping scenarios, what happens is for canola, obviously becomes worse. So if we've doubled the price, the ratios have basically halved. So, you know, putting nitrogen on marginal to adequate canola crops to support a 5 to 1 grain response per kilogram of N does not make sense. You're barely breaking even. Whereas, again, putting it on a canola crop, you're still getting that 3 to 4 to 1. So reasonable risk premium in doing that. If we come across to cereals, the same rules tend to apply, although, you know, in low responsive situations in cereals, you'd have to, have to be thinking about if we're getting less than 15 kilograms of grain per kilogram of N. So anyone that's putting 100 kilograms of N on, and they're getting less than a tonne and a half response, you've got to question whether it's going to pay with the nitrogen prices. But certainly once we get up to the 25, then we're getting into ranges where you'd say it's a reasonable risk. Any questions about that concept? It's sort of looking at the risk return ratio and saying, okay, which is the best place to put it, and where do we prune the rates to put it on somewhere else? Okay, I'll move on. So the next question is, okay, if we want to change our rates, how do I determine my rate? And, you know, it really comes down to, there are a range of ways. People actually come up with the rate that they're using, or they might identify with the rate that some it's the same as usual and it's indeterminate about how they actually came up with the original rate, but they're just going to do what they did last year or that in a bit. People can use an end balance approach, and I'll explain that a little bit more. You can use an end budget, which is really a physical analysis of the different pools and how much the crop requires and how those pools are going to supply it and what the deficit is. We can think about the nitrogen bank approach, which I'll discuss a little bit further. We can use something like CropWise, which is a tool that looks at a range of interactions as well as nitrogen availability to come up with a probabilistic range for likely outcomes from nitrogen supply. I put a star beside those three because in reality, to do those well, you need a soil test to at least 60 centimetres to run those. We can use historic grain protein algorithms to come up with, as I showed you, a relationship between the soil nitrogen content and the protein from last year or a range of cereal crops in the past. We can use plant tissue with a dilution function or not. We can use enriched strips to guide in crop. We can use economic optimization models, which are probably more used in Western Australia and are largely undeveloped in Eastern Australia for seasonal use. Or we can use a partial budget, a cost benefit from a response curve type approach, which once again is not well developed because in Eastern Australia. So the ones I wanted to talk a little bit more further about and in understanding just what they do and what their ability to reflect a change in rate that might be useful under these circumstances. So a simple end balance is really just your removal factor. So, for wheat, it's 20 kilograms per tonne. For barley, it's 15. For sorghum, it's 15. And then times the yield. And that's a very simple to calculate. And there's a range of other things that are good about it. But the cons doesn't consider the seasonal soil nitrogen supply capacity. So, if you've got lots of water and no nitrogen, then in the soil, and we're unaware of the soil's ability to supply, we can end up with a long way short just using a simple end balance. In the long term, if you did that over 15 years and you use your soil end balance, and you're willing to take unders and overs, which is the premise that end banks work on, then it can work. But it's not something to base seasonal decisions about nitrogen rates on, in my opinion. And the other thing down the bottom there, in the longer term, it tends to consume soil organic matter nitrogen that contributes, and it contributes to more rapid organic matter decline, just using nitrogen rates that are based seasonally on last year's yield. So the simple end budget, which is probably the thing most people do, they use that that removal, they divide it by a number, whether that's or they multiply it by either 2 or 2.5, which relates to 20 or 40% uptake efficiency, and take away the soil mineral nitrogen. Fairly simple calculation, and it's probably the most used one around. And what it does, in fact, is it considers the soil mineral N to lower the fertiliser cost in any one year. So what's residual fertiliser from last year and unused nitrogen from the previous season, as long as we don't lose it through some loss mechanism, it's allowing you to use that to lower the fertiliser cost in any one year. But a couple of downsides of the N budget. It assumes that all N sources are equally efficient. So it's insensitive to extreme skews in lower and higher nitrogen pill contribution. So, if your biological mineralized organic matter is higher efficient than your fertilizer, it does not take that into account. It just counts everything at the same. And that can, when you get, say, high organic matter or a high input from a legume crop, or an extremely low nitrogen from mineral soil nitrogen, it can skew the numbers quite considerably to over fertilizing or under fertilizing. And it doesn't consider the contribution of organic matter sources if trying to minimise seasonal fertiliser N. So, if we really want to, and I'll show you the effect of this a bit later on, the other negative as well as SNMN up there could be mineralised nitrogen, which would be a minus, and that minimises your nitrogen rate this year. But as I said for the previous one, if you start making that mineralized nitrogen minus, then you are probably increasing the mining of soil carbon and running down your soil organic pool. The N bank is a fairly new concept in decision supports. It's something that I think we recognised in the long-term trials many years ago, that if you put on removal over a 20-year period, then it approximated about the best rate to stabilise organic carbon in the northern systems. I suppose the pros of it are likely to contribute to that stabilisation of organic matter, and it uses the accumulation of fertiliser from the previous efficiency to offset demand variability. Unfortunately, this season it would see that we're in a double negative situation, is we have high fertiliser costs and the N bank has been emptied. In other words, like a bank account, we've got very high interest costs to buy in money, and our bank account's empty. So if we need to fill it up to meet a demand or a purchase, then it's expensive to put in there and we don't have a lot of reserve. And that's what we're facing this season with the N bank. It's not a good year to necessarily start necessarily an N bank. But it's in a way that people are looking at it. The cons, unproven across a range of crop species and rotations and regions, although there is a growing body of information that would suggest it's probably going to work. And the other one is the robber in the room. Particularly in some locations, soil mineral N bank is subject to seasonal wipeouts. So if we've got it all stuck in the bank and we get a big denitrification event, or in a sandy soil get a big leaching event, then all of that bank is not necessarily crop available, and we've just had a reasonable loss of income, and it has to be replaced to be able to continue trading. So each of them's got pros and cons, but how do they relate to each other? What I did was actually ran I suppose calculations for each of these to compare the N that would come out of a situation with 45 kilograms of soil mineral nitrogen 0 to 60. Now that relates to a number of 15, about 3 milligrams per kilogram 0 to 60, and a 4 tonne per hectare yield. Now that's just a randomly picked set of numbers, and I just ran each of those calculations. So for a simple N balance, that came out with 81 kilograms of nitrogen required. If I ran a N balance, and I've called it detailed, but I just add 30% on, because I did read a paper recently that suggested, it did perform reasonably well in a slew of different modelled outcomes. So if we add 30%, it came out at 105. But remember, those ones don't take into account what the soil's supplying, and we've got no ability to trade that off if we need to. A simple N budget came out at 116. a detailed budget. In other words, the detail was I took off an amount of, this was for a situation where it had a 1.8% organic carbon, and 60% of the mineralisation. It was a southern one where 60% of the mineralisation happened post-sampling. It reduced the number to 42. So you can see it's going to give you the lowest number, but it's going to rely on the soil mineral N and the mineralisation estimate to actually reduce it to supply the crop of 4 tonne at those sort of rates. Now, a lot of that was around the organic carbon because the number was around, it was going to supply obviously 40 or 50 kilograms of mineralisable N from that 1.8% organic carbon. The other one that I ran was a simple N bank for an area for a 4 tonne per hectare yield, or it's about the decile 5 year, the average yield of a decile 5 year, and it came out around 140. So you can see there's a range of numbers you can generate depending on which method you've been using. What I would suggest is that you don't, in this circumstance, change the approach. If you're using a simple balance, stick to it and maybe, think about maybe 10 or 15% reduction in rates, but don't change the method just because it's got a lower number. I think consistency in the way that you approach it's probably important. It's not taking drastic measures in jumping between methods. And what it says is probably for the future when we run through this time that we're in now, there's probably a time to reevaluate which way you want to actually calculate nitrogen rates for the future. The other question, if we're talking about mineral N availability, then it's not only how much, but where. And each of those profiles represents 150 kilograms of nitrogen in that 120 centimetres of soil that's been sampled. Now, there's obviously going to be very different ways the crop is going to approach or maybe showing that different distribution, certainly between number 1 and number 3 in those scenarios. So when something around 60 to 70% of the nitrogen in profile 1 is above 60 centimetres and the rest of it's below. The opposite is the case for in situation number 3. So, your strategy around nitrogen needs to take into account just where it is. Obviously, I would think most ideal would be number 2. We can get over that early mineral nitrogen deficit with a bit of starter fertilizer with nitrogen in it in the case of number 2. And if we've got water coincident with that 30 to 60 layer, then we're looking pretty good for the season. Just be very careful about where the nitrogen is. And it allows us to make some decisions about, say in situation 1, deferment of decisions about nitrogen to well in crop, because the early crop's going to look after itself. It doesn't need pre-plant in, it's got plenty. So these things tell us about timing of nitrogen. So, do we need to go in pre-plant to support the thing up till the end of tillering, and grow tillers, or do we need something to support post elongation when we're starting to get into grain number being set? So not only how much, but where is important. Any comments on that before I move on to the four R's side of things, of just some considerations around, products, rates, timing, all of those things?
nothing in chat yet, Chris.
Okay, so no burning questions. I suppose this sort of comes on the back of probably most people will have access to some urea, and the question is there enough, and if there's not enough there and we need to do top dressing, what are the things we should be looking at? And when in looking at products, we always look at the form and release characteristics. We're used to urea. We know how it releases. We know its release characteristics when put into the soil or on the soil. If we're looking at alternate products, we've got to look at them in relation to the release characteristics and the concentration in the products, because the concentration could very well these other characteristics, concentration, handling characteristics, really affect the logistics on the farm. So if you've suddenly got to get the same, you've got a quarter of the concentration, therefore you've got 4 times as much product to go out to get the same amount of nitrogen on, given that they have the same release characteristics, then we've got to cater for 4 times as much product in the same time frame of getting it on. Now, is that logistically practical? So understanding those things ahead of time is pretty important as to, if I can get hold of this stuff, does that change the way I have to get about, and how early I start and how late I can leave the decision? And obviously the relative price of the nitrogen in the product in or on the ground. It's not just what did it cost me at the port or or into the silo, but what's it cost me into the ground? Because there is obviously, if you start handling different products, then the relative cost of machinery cost and labor cost to get it into the ground can be quite different for different products. So what have we got out there that's available? Obviously urea, the one we're all concerned about because it is such a big proportion of what is used and has been used. Anhydrous ammonia, again, limited supply and limited distribution, but it's still a viable product. But once we get much past where we are now, obviously not a top dress or an in-crop type product. So the window for anhydrous ammonia is probably closing very, very quickly. In some areas, UAN solution, and it's probably one that we might see a little bit more of, because if you've got limited urea and we can convince the mining industry to give up some of the AN, then mixing them together, because there's a lot of ammonium nitrate made in Australia compared to urea, then by diluting it, it might extend the supply somewhat. So UAN solution's another possibility, but once again, it's a liquid, not a solid, so it requires specialist application equipment, as does anhydrous ammonia. I've thrown calcium ammonium nitrate in there, reasonable nitrogen concentration, relatively high price per kilogram of N, but if there was no N available, urea, product supplies of other products dried up, it's something that that is there, that it has a reasonable concentration. Another one, sulfate of ammonia, one again that we have regional production in Australia as a result of output from some mining industries or refining industries. The thing I would say with sulfate of ammonia is don't forget its volatility in newly limed soils. So a high rate of lime put on this year and hardly incorporated, or calcareous soil, could see the volatility as bad or if not worse than urea, which is what the research would tell you. So need to be careful in those situations. If we're going just on to soils with reasonable cation exchange capacity and no high lime content, then it is an alternative, albeit at half the nitrogen concentration that you're putting in urea. So, and the other thing is there probably is limited amounts available in a granular form. So the question is, can you hand a crystalline form, which is probably has more availability? The other question that people will probably have is, the place of EEFs. So your efficiency enhanced, your nitrification and urease inhibitors. I don't think that changes really in the light of the change in price of urea. I would think in the case of urea, it probably heightens the need to have a look at it because relatively they become cheaper as you re-up. So where it might have been 20% extra on the cost of urea at $690, it's probably only half of that, 10% relative to the price of nitrogen. And given you're putting it into a highly responsive situation, but it might be highly risky, it's probably not a bad thing. So I wouldn't rule out EEFs used in the right place for the right reason. Given the prices of urea, in some cases I could give justification why it's more important to consider them than not use them at all, because it's just adding to the price. The other one is the use of seemingly biosolid type products. So I'm talking about those with high nitrogen content, but they are in organic form. So those based on fish protein, blood and bone, those sorts of products, we're going to be, or are being swamped with advertising in many social media areas, and you're probably going to get, if we end up with running out of urea and some of these other things, then there will be people asking questions about how do we introduce those, or are they worth what we might being offered. So in a comment about the nitrification inhibitors, earlier this year I did a bit of a study about where they would be benefit to winter crops in Australia and looked at all the GRDC trials, and basically they say the benefits are modest compared to the savings you get in nitrogen, in carbon accounting and greenhouse gas lost, and it tends to be around 0 to 10 kilograms saved on average seasons across all of the sites in Australia. But as it says there were clearer benefits in the higher rainfall zone, and the benefits tended to be in the range 10 to 60 kilograms per hectare saved. But it come down to strategy, and that was on average. Now, the high rainfall zone, if I relate those high rainfall zone to a decile 9 spring, you can see those areas here are where it would appear in the average season there may be some argument for the use of EEFs, particularly nitrification inhibitors. But if you take a decile 9 spring and it really extends the area quite significantly. So there becomes a lot of central high, the higher rainfalls in central New South Wales, right through Victoria and into South Australia, where those high rainfall zone benefits could accrue into a larger area. Now, I'm not sure how much credence you'd give in predicting a decile 9 spring, but they are the sorts of numbers of where there are essential benefits. So if you started out with a full profile, or you end up with a full profile of moisture across that area by late August, and there is a chance of more rain or reasonable rain to finish off, you'd have to think that you should be considering these sorts of tactics. So there's little benefit where late spring rainfall, there's where the soils are already high in N, or where there's been a legume crop or a legume dominant pasture. They reduce risk, they don't eliminate it. So it's one of those risk management tools like insurance. So if you're in a situation, the thing with these things though is if you look at how they work and do a little bit of modeling, this is a busy graph and I'll explain it for you. This bottom is the soil temperature. Now, the release of urea and the release of nitrogen from nitrification inhibitors is related to soil temperature by and large. There are a couple of other factors, but here's the soil temperature. This is modelled for Wagga Wagga between May and October. And I've just done it blocks in temperature across there. So you can see, and this is starting on the, applied to late April and planted on the 1st of May. And that's the soil temperature we're dealing with. So somewhere between about 14 degrees and about 20 degrees by the time we're getting towards the end of the crop. If we applied urea here, basically that's what's the end release without nitrification inhibitor. So over a 3 week period around 15 degrees, it's going to release the nitrogen to being nitrate in a curve that looks like this. So 90% of it will happen between 2 and 3 weeks. If we put a nitrification inhibitor on it, then this is the response, the curve. So 90% of it will be released by 121 days after application. Here's the nitrogen demand curve, which is what we're trying to actually simulate with our release pattern. So there's not a bad agreement with there. In meeting crop demand. It's, this one's not going down and that one's going up or anything like that. But what's happening is with this is that the nitrogen that's in there, the difference between with and without, is the nitrogen that's at risk. There is some more nitrogen over here. Well, everything between that curve and there is at risk. So that's what we're trying to actually, if you've got a circumstances, soils, seasons where you've got a reasonable risk of loss during that period, then that's the difference that's going to happen where you've got controlled release versus without. If I move the application later, what that does is shifts this curve and shifts the shape of it because it starts at a lower temperature. And what we have happen is in the worst case of, say, putting it on in as part of a top dressing in late August, September, and we end up with only 50% of it released by the time the crop actually needs it. So they're the two extremes. It all releases before the crop needs it, or it releases afterwards. And that's why understanding this relationship between release patterns and uptake and the release with and without is pretty important to make decisions around the use of these types of products. Application method. What we've got to do is maximize efficiency within the logistical limits. So, one of the things that is, there's two ways, one of the ways that we can actually, I suppose, cope with the lack of nitrogen is to make what we've got more efficient. And it's the method, timing and placement that are probably pretty important. So one of the things that possibly still is in a window for some people and maybe not for others is recognizing where we've got highly responsive conditions with high stubble loads, which are probably coincident this year with the size of crops in some areas, and our understanding of how low the mineral nitrogen is at that stage. Banding is more efficient than broadcast, and that can be up to 30%. And that's on the back of, remember, spread on the soil with a high stubble load and then incorporated may immobilise 6 to 12 kilograms of nitrogen per tonne of stubble in contact with the urea or with the nitrogen. Now that's something we can't afford. That nitrogen, yes, it will come back next year, not this year. It takes about 8 to 12 weeks of mineralization, immobilization reactions with temperatures between 15 and 25 degrees and soil moisture at field capacity to run through that stage till nitrate is released, and we have a net increase in soil nitrogen. So we just got to be very careful we don't end up minimising rates and putting it in a broadcast, incorporating stubble with it, and we end up with too little, and we start to see stripes and all sorts of ugly things as a result of an immobilisation event that is significant. Timing, uh, I suppose there's logistics involved. There's this consideration of phenology, but overall, it would be nice to be able to, wherever we are, to target the most effective timing. And for cereals and canola, that Z30 and budding in canola is the prime time. You can see this is a graph of growth stage. This is for wheat or winter cereals and relative efficiency. So if you said Z31, Z30, 31 is 100%, it's the best time to put it on wheat. You can see the relativity of how quickly it can drop off on either side relative to putting it on at the right time on the right conditions. Um, but once again, logistics always plays into that. Not everyone can apply it at that stage, and we usually make trade-offs. But in some cases, particularly in the north, we don't have the rainfall to get the benefit of that, and pre-plant, well, we can only use the other things that we've talked about is product selection rate and placement really, and then allocation between the crops to because the application timing is usually fixed by the reliability of spring rainfall. The other thing is don't forget to monitor if you make changes and think about monitoring them to see whether they are on track or not. And plant tissue is always a consideration. So think about that as part of monitoring. If we get the rate wrong, right up until flag leaf, there is an opportunity to, if we got a break in the weather, to get a little bit more on to correct any wrong assumptions that we might make at this time of year. So, think about particularly the root system. With nitrogen being mobile and distributed down the profile, timing of measuring nitrogen in the plant is critical. It's not like trace elements where you can do it early. You've got to think about, are the roots foraging at 60 centimetres? If they're foraging and particularly if you've got a water probe down at 0 to 60 and you can see water being extracted at 60 centimetres, then that's you understand that the roots are getting nitrate from down there and they're accessing the whole profile. Then you can make a decision about sampling nitrogen at that timing. So phenological stages, it's not a thing to measure too early. Because the roots have not found all those sources, easy accessible sources in the top 60 centimetres. So be guided by the root system as to the timing and to some extent the phenological stage. Guys in the south, around the end of tillering, Z30 is probably the ideal time of doing it because we know the root system will be down towards 60 centimetres and we know the demand is just about to take place. So we can time a nitrogen application based on checking on that. Plant part, you can use youngest expanded blade or you can use the whole tops. Whole tops tends to be a bit messy at that stage. To get the number of plants and get them to the lab and get analysis. But there is the ability through decision support systems to actually interpret both. This is one that we've got in the Optera tips and tools. which is a plant tissue one for the major nutrients, where you can just dial in the growth stage and put your lab results in manually, and it'll tell you just where you sit and whether it's less than optimum and what range you should be looking at, and a percent adequacy. So there are tools around. So critical ranges, or you might be able to get hold of an end dilution type approach later in the season. And if anyone wants to know more about that, we can talk about it later. So that's sort of most of the information I wanted to present. As I said, just summing up, we've got two scenarios, and the general approach that I would suggest that you think about for the options that you've got left for nitrogen for this season. If we're only facing high price and we've got no supply problems after April, using less N but feeding most crops on the farm is probably a better way to do it, or redistributing on the basis of potential responsiveness if you can understand what that might be. If we've got high price and short supply, invest where it behaves like a high return asset. In other words, this is where you start to look at some of the paddocks that traditionally have lower yields and are consistently lower yielding, of saying, hey, I should fallow those or do something else with them, because they're not giving me 5 to 15 or 15 to 25 kilograms of grain per kilogram of N when I put it on. Leave them out, because they're going to cost you money. So in summary, rank your paddocks by expected return, kilograms of grain per kilogram of N, which you can do pretty well based on mineral soil nitrogen at this time of year. Adjust for crop type and end use. So make those decisions about whether it's better off going on canola or wheat or barley or oats. The earlier we can get a return on the nitrogen, probably the better, which suggests if you've got good markets and good prices for oats, biomass for hay or silage or something, probably a good way of using N. If you want less nitrogen per kilo of ton sold off, you might think about barley. And then there's that trade-off I showed you between responsiveness, crop price, and nitrogen price for wheat and canola. Assess the yield potential with and without N. Have you got some zero strips there so you can understand, last time I did that, I used 50 kilograms of N and the thing was, and the zero strip came in a ton less. That's that 20 kilograms of grain per kilogram of N. So if you've got those things, dig them out and have a close look at them for the paddock to see just what sort of responses you are getting. Allocate N to the maximum marginal return, so that incremental N. Prioritise timing over total rate. So if you can if you've got the option to shift some of your pre-plant into Z30 for cereals and canola, that wouldn't be a bad way to try and help the efficiency and get higher yields for the same rate, or a marginal reduction in rate and keep the same yield. And use a simple allocation rule. Develop some simple allocation rules, which are practical shortcuts, and and have a look at all the paddocks on the farm. So look, that's all that the comments that I've got. We can go into some deeper ones with questions, but Jack, Katie, I'll throw it over to you. Happy to, thanks for your participation, and we're always happy for people to follow up and inquire on what we can do or what more information we can provide you.
Beauty. Thanks, Chris. So, as Chris said, that's it for the formal part of the presentation. So we want to take any questions that we can now. I'm just going to throw another poll at you quickly while everyone's musing over what they might want to ask. Just a couple of simple questions there. As I said, we really appreciate the feedback. This poll in particular, these questions will help us determine any follow-up webinars that we'd like to do. Okay, we've got a couple of questions coming in the chat. So Ross has asked, green manure crop. Green manure chickpeas, if destroyed in July, when would be available? When would N be available?
The availability relates to, I'll go back to basics. The availability relates to a couple of things. It's like the release of nitrogen from any fertilizer that I showed before. So the chickpeas will have a lower C to N ratio than a wheat crop will. So a green chickpea crop, it's probably going to be below 20. Whereas a wheat stubble or something like that's going to be up around 80. So that immediately tells you that you are going to see nitrogen not taken from the soil or minimal taken from the soil, and the process will likely be quicker than it would be for wheat stubble. I mentioned that wheat stubble, in any process of release of nitrogen, there is this shuttle between what we would call mineralization and immobilization. So and we look at things at a paddock level, but really things are happening at a biological level at certain places in the soil. And we can have immobilization and mineralization going on at the same time in the soil at different locations, depending on whether there is a surplus of carbon relative to nitrogen, or there is a surplus of nitrogen relative to carbon. So the release, we would say net mineralization is where most of the soil and most of the biology recognises we have a surplus of nitrogen relative to carbon to keep their population at a high level. And so we end up with nitrate being residual in the soil, being the form that most things don't want to use when there's no carbon around. Now, the period that the release is related to is wetting and drying cycles and temperature. So at the depth in the soil that you incorporate the stubble, you need coincidence. You need moisture to drive it. So something above wilting point, up through to field capacity, and you need soil temperature. And for every, I suppose, every 5 degrees the soil temperature increases, then the rate doubles. So with chickpeas planted in April, terminated in July, the things that we've got going for us, if we want to turn that round into sorghum, is the fact that the soil temperature is probably going to be 10 or 12 degrees. So the mineralisation is going to be slow until we get till September, October. And 2, August, September are the driest parts of the year in Northern Australia. So we have a coincidence of cool temperatures and a lack of moisture in that top 30 centimetres. So the release you would expect is probably 4 to 6 weeks under ideal conditions. That being 15 to 25 degrees and good soil moisture the most of the time in that layer. So, I can't put an absolute number on it, but I would say that you would possibly see benefits of that nitrogen towards the end of a sorghum crop, not at the start.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. Ross, did you have any follow-up on that? We've got a couple of other questions, so I'll move on if not.
That's what I expected. Probably looking more for it'll be again just an idea to let the growers know that we are pretty much pushing shit uphill.
Yeah, well, On that, I'll move on to Matt's. So I'm looking at a manure test that says for every wet ton spread, it's contributing 11 kilos of N. So I spread 5 tons per hectare, 55 units of N, and don't incorporate it other than KPPWS either within a week. How much N will be retained for that crop?
Is there a breakdown of the ammonium N in that test as well? The reason I ask is,
We're
well,
just looking.
probably. Sorry, go ahead.
He's just having a look, Chris. So
Yeah,
I think he's trying
the
to dig up
reason
the
I
results.
ask is if there's a high ammonium content, it'll be the same as urea. You spread it on the surface and you'll lose most of it. That nitrogen content is ammonium, and possibly if it's reasonably fresh and wet out of feedlots, then a lot of the nitrogen could be urine based, which means it'll be urea. And there is potential if you don't incorporate it to lose whatever proportion is there as that ammonium nitrogen or urea content that's in it. If it's been composted, if it's been aged, then most of that reaction will be well, the nitrogen will have been lost. That volatile nitrogen would have been lost prior to you taking it in. And in any one season, then the best you would be able to expect is about 40% of it to contribute to the nitrogen in the crop. Now, that also relates to you would need to make sure that it is incorporated, because if it sits on the surface, it's the first place to dry. And as I was describing with the chickpeas, even though you might have soil temperature, it will dry out all the time. And therefore the biology don't have a medium in which to break it down, to release the nitrogen that's there in organic forms.
Yep, makes sense. This test just has a total nitrogen, so it's probably not very helpful.
What'd you say? It was 1.1.
Yeah.
What was the moisture content?
Close to 50.
Okay, so it must be relatively fresh.
It's pig manure. Yeah.
Oh, it's pig. Yeah,
yeah.
okay. Well then, yeah, no, pig's different. Yeah, look, that'll be, yeah, it'll be the same. If you spread it on the surface, then, yeah, if it's been through a pig pond and it's come out of there, most of the volatiles have gone. That's what you smell. Then that'll mostly be organic sources, and it goes the same. It's going to contribute not a lot in the short term, and most of those organic sources are for background contribution to the soil rather than necessarily response in the next crop, particularly if it's not incorporated.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, we've got another one from Darren. Chris, do you think our deep end testing early post-emergent in crop is a more accurate end measurement than doing it now? Given we have good moisture and mineralisation occurring at the moment, should be very good.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I expected that one would come up. Look, in any, I suppose, assessment of deep N, it is always a consideration of how much of the mineralisation that could take place since we harvested and before we harvest again has taken place at the time that we sampled. Now, if you've had good moisture, particularly reasonable wetting and drying events across the summer, and that doesn't have to be 100 mils. That's falls of 5, 10, 15 mils on occasions. That's all it takes is 2 or 3 days, 4 days of moisture, and particularly in the top 10 centimetres, it'll nitrify very, very quickly. So I would suggest if you're saying that you've had reasonable amount, then you will get some nitrification in spring. But the more we've had in fallow, the more accurate those mineral nitrogens are of the total mineral pool. So, the way that you might look at it is on an annual basis, about 2 or 3% of the total N in the soil turns over annually. So if you said you had an organic carbon of 1, that relates to about 20 to 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare will annualise every year out of that organic carbon. Maybe 25 to 35 if you take bulk density into account. So it's really thinking about... Sorry?
We've had about, somewhere between 100 to 200 mil in the last sort of 5 weeks, and nothing over summer before that. So it's all happened in the last 6 weeks.
So the surface soil is still wet?
Yeah, yep.
What the soil temperature would be probably 20 to 25 in the top 10 centimetres?
Yep.
I would suggest that for all of that period, it has been nitrifying. It's been going through this nitrification immobilisation process for at least 5 or 6 weeks at a rapid pace.
Are we being hopeful and hoping we've got our first 50 kilos urea mineralising at the moment?
I would think so, yes.
Yeah, good.
Well, for an organic carbon of between 1 and 2, you'd have to think that soil mineral nitrogen that you're seeing, if you sample now, will include 50 kilograms of nitrogen that has come out in the last 6 weeks.
Yeah, this is something we haven't seen for over 10 years. So
yes, very different. The other one that's significant is that's background from cereal to cereal. If you have had a pulse crop in there, there's a possibility of another 12 kilograms of N per tonne of pulse stubble.
Yep.
Alrighty. Well, that's our last question from the chat. If there's nothing else, then we can wrap up. Appreciate all of your time. I know it's been a bit of a long one, but hopefully it's been productive for you. So we'll send out a wrap up email this afternoon. It'll have the recording, so feel free to shoot that around. Obviously, you can go back and watch it at any time. Thanks again for putting those responses into the poll. So one of those questions in particular around whether you're interested in us working with you to go through some of these tools, please reply to that email that we'll send out this afternoon, just with that you're looking for. And we look forward to talking to you all again soon.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks everyone
for joining. Thanks, Jack.
Cheers.